The two earliest representations we have of Boudicca were written by the ancient historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio in 117 and 235 AD respectively. Tacitus tells us in his annals that Boudicca is married to Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, which is one of the Celtic tribes in East Anglia. When he dies in 60 AD, he leaves his kingdom to his daughters and to the Roman emperor, to make the emperor happy. Instead, the Romans take over. Boudicca is beaten, her daughters raped, and the Icenian chiefs treated like slaves. So the Iceni rebel. They attack and plunder the Roman towns of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. Eventually, the Roman general Suetonius gathers his men, 10,000 in all, and confronts Boudicca and her men, choosing the battleground carefully. The Iceni attempt to flee, but they are slowed by the baggage supply line and massacred. Boudicca poisons herself. Tacitus represents the Iceni as a savage and vengeful tribe, furious with the Romans and taking it out violently. He doesn't name Boudicca as their leader until the final battle, when she rode around in her chariot encouraging the men. In this speech he shows clearly that she was fierce and brave. However, after this he barely mentions her except to say Boudicca poisoned herself. He tells us of the battles she won, but he only goes into the Romans' strategy and tactics. When he describes the battle, he says the Romans charged, they demolished the resistance, and the Iceni fled. He doesn't really go into any detail of what happened in between, making it seem quick and easy. He represents Boudicca as a brave but savage leader who is unwilling to live in slavery, but in the end foolish to go against the Roman Empire. Cassius Dio's book Roman History told the history of Rome from its foundation to 222 AD. He also wrote about Boudicca but spelt it differently. He says much the same thing as Tacitus, but doesn't mention the rape of Boudicca's daughters. He blames the rebellion on some messy business about her loan. He also names Boudicca specifically as the person who was chiefly instrumental in rousing the natives and persuading them to fight the Romans, the person who was thought worthy to be their leader, and who directed the conduct of the entire war. Dio's writing contains the only surviving physical description of Boudicca. In stature she was very tall, in appearance most terrifying, in the glance of her eye most fierce, and her voice was harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips. She grasped a spear to aid her in terrifying all beholders. Dio tells us a lot more about what the Iceni did to the Romans in the towns they destroyed. Dio also goes into much more detail of the battle than Tacitus does. Dio's description of Boudicca is much fiercer than Tacitus's, giving an impression of a great warrior. While Tacitus gave the impression that the Romans crushed the resistance easily, Dio says it wasn't easy and it took a long time. He also disagrees with Tacitus on how exactly Boudicca died. Tacitus claims that she poisoned herself when they were defeated, but Dio says she fell ill and died. He also says that it wasn't until this point that the Iceni were scattered. Dio represents Boudicca as a fierce and bloody warrior queen who inspired zeal in her troops and challenged the Roman Empire. Firstly, even though these are our two ancient sources, they were written 120 years apart, so they had different sources available to them. Tacitus's father-in-law was responsible for the original conquest of Britain, and Tacitus got a lot of information both from him and from the Roman Senate's records. We are not completely sure what sources Dio based his writings on, however we think he used the memoirs of emperors, public administrative records, and the work of other ancient historians before him. Because Tacitus's annals were written only 60 years after the events, while Dio's account was written 200 years after, Tacitus had many more primary sources available to him. Most of Dio's research was based on what other people had written about her, which means it had more room for error or misinterpretation. Secondly, the ancient historians were not only interested in representing the facts of what happened, but also in entertaining and sometimes in teaching a lesson. This means that facts could be exaggerated or embellished to suit the purposes of the storyteller. Also, different worldviews, especially concerning the politics of Roman imperialism, could impact how they represented her. How they felt about this issue would greatly change the way they represented Boudicca challenging the empire. Of the two ancient sources, Tacitus's is probably more accurate. Tacitus and Dio were both Roman, which means they both would have been biased. Dio's work is very descriptive, but it is likely that much of this detail is embellishment to entertain his readers. At the start of his account he confessed that the whole thing was rather shameful. This means that it was in his interest to make Boudicca seem fiercer and stronger so it would be less embarrassing for the Romans. Tacitus doesn't do this. Also, despite the fact that he was Roman, Tacitus records how the Romans plundered and raped the Iceni, which doesn't make Rome look particularly good. Neither account is entirely bias-free, however Tacitus's account does seem to be more reliable. Tacitus has more plausibility because he wrote his annals much earlier, basing his writing on sources closer to the time, like his father-in-law and the Senate records. Overall, due to bias in their writings and the difference in the time they were written, Tacitus's representation of Boudicca is more accurate.
Boudicca has been represented many times and in many ways. We will be focusing on two of them: a statue of Boudicca and her daughters in London, and a Horrible Histories song about her. In the statue, Boudicca is depicted riding a chariot with two bare-chested girls crouching behind her. The chariot is pulled by two thoroughbred battle horses, although there are no reins with which to control them. On the side of the monument is an inscription reading Boadicea, Boudicca, queen of the Iceni, who died AD 61 after leading her people against the Roman invader. The two girls crouching behind her are probably her daughters because of the parts they play in her story and the way they are clinging to her defenselessly. In the statue, Boudicca looks determined and fierce. Her arms are raised in the air, spear clutched in one hand, as if she is urging an invisible army into battle. The statue is mounted on a podium, meaning she is raised up high above the crowd, making her seem more commanding. In this statue, Boudicca is represented as a fierce and powerful war leader, fighting for her people and protecting the vulnerable. On the other hand, the Horrible Histories representation is comical, because it is designed so that children can watch it. The lyrics of the song tell Boudicca's story, but not in very much detail. It says that when her husband died, he left her half his kingdom, but the Romans took it all, so she rebelled and attacked London, Colchester, and St. Albans. Then the Romans defeated her, so she took poison. The information in their lyrics present her as fierce and brave. However, the way they present the information and the colloquial and unspecific language they use makes it more comical. They say she was fierce and determined, but that's kind of ruined by her dancing and by the fact that they also call her superstar. Overall, she is represented rather comically, but it does give glimpses of the warrior who would rather die than be sold a slave to Romans. During the Victorian era, Boudicca became famous as a symbol of British colonialism. This representation of her wasn't based on any historical fact, it was because her name means victory. The representations differ firstly because they all do their research separately. They may read different versions or interpret what they find differently or focus on a different part of the account. The interpretation of sources means a lot of opinion comes into it, which also gives rise to a biased account. Secondly, they all had their own goals in their depiction of her. Thornycroft was an artist, not a historian. His goal was not to accurately represent Boudicca as she was, but to create a beautiful and impressive statue. We also see this in that he titles it Boadicea, with Boudicca in brackets. Boadicea was a much more popular version of the name, so that is what he wrote. However, it actually has no historical basis, originating from a misprint in the 16th century. Horrible Histories is trying to present her in a way that's entertaining and appropriate for children. They want to make it memorable, and they are trying to keep it PG. This changes how they represent her, because a violent rebellion is not particularly funny or PG. The statue of Boudicca in London has taken quite a lot of artistic license. Since the sculpture was British, and Boudicca was something of a British folk hero, there is plenty of room for bias. The horses pulling the chariot are English thoroughbred battle horses, nothing like the horses the Iceni tribe would have had. The chariot itself is a Roman model, and there is nothing in our ancient sources to suggest that Boudicca's daughters were with her in the chariot. As mentioned before, there are no reins, so these horses are pulling the chariot wherever they feel like going. Most of this statue has been tailored to make a dramatic and heroic statue. It may have a basis in the historical story, but it is not very accurate. The information in the Horrible History song is mostly accurate, except at the start where it says that when Boudicca's husband died, he left half of his kingdom to her. This has no historical foundation, and the early sources tell us King Prasutagus left his kingdom not to his wife but to his daughters. The costumes are fairly generic and could be reused for medieval peasants. The Iceni did use war paint, however their paint was blue, not black. Lastly, the Iceni and the Romans actually fought and drew blood. They didn't just dance the whole time. The information was mostly accurate, however the visual representation wasn't, meaning the overall representation of Boudicca and the image of her it leaves is not particularly accurate at all. Neither representation is very accurate, however the statue of her is slightly more accurate because it has captured the fact that she was a warrior and she killed people. Because it is an image only and doesn't spell out the story of what happened, it can't screw that up. Overall, Boudicca was represented as a fierce, brave and powerful warrior queen who liked to dance.